Hollywood's golden age wasn't all glitz and glamour. Beyond the mainstream hits lurked shocking films that pushed boundaries so far they vanished completely. Studios buried them. Critics condemned them. Entire countries banned them outright. These aren't just controversial films. They're the ones that shook society to its core and disappeared from history. Until now. The Outlaw, 1943. Howard Hughes unleashed pure chaos with this Western that cared more about Jane Russell's figure than the actual plot. The film took 6 years to release because censors lost their minds over Russell's revealing costumes. Hughes designed a special bra just for her and fought the Hays Code for years. Billboards were banned in multiple cities, and theater owners faced actual arrests for showing it. Critics called it vile and unfit for public exhibition. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it immediately. Entire cities banned it outright. Despite all the controversy, or because of it, the Outlaw pulled in massive profits, earning over $5 million on a modest budget. Hughes himself later admitted the film pushed too far. He actually disowned it completely. The advertising campaign focused almost entirely on Russell's physique, with infamous taglines like, "What are the 2 reasons for Jane Russell's rise to stardom?" Theater lines stretched for blocks during its limited release. Film historian David Thompson later called it the moment Hollywood discovered controversy could be more profitable than quality. Freaks, 1932. Todd Browning's career never recovered after this one. Fresh off directing Dracula, Browning cast real carnival performers with physical disabilities to tell a revenge tale that still disturbs audiences today. MGM executives reportedly vomited during the first screening. One woman threatened to sue, claiming the film caused her miscarriage. Test audiences ran screaming from theaters. MGM panicked, cutting the original 90-minute film down to just 64 minutes. The missing footage, reportedly containing even more shocking scenes, has never been found. Pennsylvania banned it entirely. The UK prohibited it for 30 years straight, calling it exploitative and morally corrupt. Despite being a commercial disaster that nearly bankrupted the studio, Freaks eventually became one of the most studied cult films in history. Director David Lynch called it the ultimate outsider cinema, decades ahead of its time. The famous wedding feast scene where the performers chant, one of us," has been referenced countless times in pop culture. Browning, who had worked in actual circuses as a young man, fought studio heads to cast authentic performers rather than use makeup effects. The film's commercial failure was so devastating that MGM removed their logo from prints to distance themselves from it. In 1994, it was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry for being culturally significant. The Miracle, 1948. Roberto Rossellini created an international incident with this 40-minute film about a peasant woman who believes a wandering stranger is actually Saint Joseph. When she becomes pregnant, she believes it's a miracle. Catholic organizations went ballistic, calling it sacrilegious and a mockery of faith. New York's Commissioner of Licenses revoked the theater's permit, claiming the film was officially blasphemous. Cardinal Spellman personally condemned it from the pulpit of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Protesters formed human chains blocking theater entrances. The controversy reached the Supreme Court, resulting in a landmark 1952 decision that film was protected under the First Amendment. The case single-handedly destroyed the power of religious censorship boards across America. Joseph Burston, the distributor who fought all the way to the Supreme Court, called it the most important battle in American film history. Federico Fellini, who co-wrote the script, later said the film was meant as a tribute to religious faith, not an attack. Anna Magnani's raw performance as the peasant woman was initially praised before the controversy overshadowed it. The Supreme Court case, Burston versus Wilson, established that movies deserved the same First Amendment protections as literature and other art forms. Before this ruling, films were considered merely commercial products without artistic merit. Justice Tom C. Clark wrote in the decision that the New York ban was a restraint on freedom of speech that couldn't be tolerated in a free society. Babyface, 1933. Barbara Stanwyck destroyed her good girl image playing Lily Powers, a woman who explicitly sleeps her way from basement speakeasy to penthouse boardroom. The original cut was so scandalous that Warner Brothers was forced to recall and destroy prints after initial screenings. The studio reshot entire sequences, adding scenes of moral punishment. The Catholic Legion of Decency, which basically ran the moral police at the time, condemned it for glorifying immoral behavior. Multiple states rejected it outright. The New York Censorship Board demanded 14 specific cuts before allowing it to screen. The uncut version vanished completely until 2004, when film archivists discovered a pristine original print in a Library of Congress vault. Martin Scorsese called its rediscovery one of the most important film restorations of the century. What makes Babyface extraordinary is how brazenly it depicts Lily's calculated rise using Nietzschean philosophy, explicitly taught to her by a cobbler who encourages her to use men to get the things you want. The film's original ending showed her triumphant rather than punished. Director Alfred E. Green used innovative vertical camera movements to show her literally climbing the corporate ladder, floor by floor. When the production code was strictly enforced just months later, it specifically prohibited plots showing characters profiting from immoral behavior, directly targeting films like Babyface. Stanwyck later called it the role that taught me how powerful cinema could be. Scarface, 1932. Howard Hawks' gangster film was considered so dangerous that it was banned in 5 states and numerous cities, despite massive changes demanded by censors. The original cut reportedly contained 3 times more violence. Hughes battled the Hays office for over a year, even taking them to court. Chicago's chief of police personally threatened theater owners who tried screening it. The film's realistic depiction of mob violence terrified authorities who believed it would inspire copycat crimes. The New York Times called it an overwhelming indictment of gang rule in America and of the public for tolerating it. Even James Cagney himself eventually admitted the movie went too far. He ended up completely disowning it. It never really got a second life either. It's one of those movies that it got banned for being edgy at the time, but today barely anyone even remembers it existed. Howard Hawks' gangster film was considered so dangerous that it was banned in 5 states and numerous cities, despite massive changes demanded by censors. Paul Muni stars as Tony Camonte, loosely based on Al Capone, who violently rises through Chicago's criminal underworld. The film's realistic depiction of mob violence terrified authorities who believed it would inspire copycat crimes. The original ending showed Tony going down in a blaze of glory, but censors demanded changes because they felt it glorified Tony and his criminal empire too much. Producer Howard Hughes believed the censorship was due to ulterior and political motives of corrupt politicians. Even after extensive edits, the film was banned in several cities and states in the U.S., as well as some countries around the world. Despite being one of the most talked about films of 1932, its limited showings caused it to perform poorly at the box office. It became one of the major films that pushed Hollywood to strictly enforce the production code in 1934, forever changing American cinema. Today, though it was considered shocking at the time, modern viewers might find it rather bloodless, showing how dramatically film standards have changed. Island of Lost Souls, 1932. The first adaptation of H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau shocked audiences with its disturbing imagery of human-animal hybrids. Charles Laughton's Dr. Moreau conducts gruesome vivisection experiments on animals to transform them into humans. His line, "Do you know what it means to feel like God?" sent censors into a frenzy. The UK banned it outright for 25 years, calling it against nature. Australia refused classification until 1958. 12 U.S. states prohibited screenings, with one censor board calling it repulsive, vulgar, and potentially harmful to mental health. H.G. Wells himself despised the adaptation, saying they turned his scientific cautionary tale into a horror film. The film's makeup effects were so disturbing that Universal Studios banned its makeup artist from using similar techniques in future productions. The movie's infamous scene with the Panther Woman caused particular outrage. Kathleen Burke won a nationwide contest to play the role, becoming an overnight sensation. Director Early C. Kenton used shadowy lighting and minimal explanation to make the horrific experiments all the more disturbing. When Paramount attempted a theatrical re-release in 1941, every single state censorship board rejected it again. Film historian David J. Skall called it the most effectively disturbing science fiction horror film of the pre-code era. Salt of the Earth, 1954. A film so controversial, the federal government tried destroying it. Based on an actual zinc miners' strike, this pro-labor, feminist film was made by blacklisted Hollywood talent during the height of McCarthyism. The production faced armed vigilantes, deportation of its lead actress, and equipment sabotage. The U.S. Department of Justice labeled it foreign political propaganda under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which meant anyone distributing the film had to report every screening to the government. Basically, they blacklisted it without officially banning it. Only 12 theaters in America would show it. Projectionist unions refused to run it. The American Legion picketed screenings. Despite this suppression, it's now preserved in the National Film Registry as culturally significant. Martin Scorsese called it one of the most honest and powerful films ever made about workers in America. Director Herbert Biberman was one of the Hollywood 10, imprisoned for refusing to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. After his release, no studio would hire him, so he and other blacklisted artists formed their own production company. When the crew arrived in New Mexico, armed vigilantes ran them out of town. The film's lead actress, Mexican star Rosaura Revueltas, was arrested and deported during filming. Laboratories refused to process the footage, and theaters were threatened with boycotts if they showed it. Howard Hughes personally offered to buy and destroy all copies. The Oxbow Incident, 1943. This anti-lynching Western was so controversial that theater owners in the South refused to screen it. Henry Fonda stars in this brutal examination of mob justice where 3 innocent men are hanged by vigilantes. The film's unflinching indictment of American frontier justice infuriated audiences expecting typical Western heroics. Studio head Daryl F. Zanuck was reportedly told, "Make this film and you'll lose your shirt." It bombed catastrophically, earning just $750,000 on a $1.5 million budget. Zanuck himself had to fight the Production Code Administration to keep the lynching scene intact. Despite its commercial failure, it received a Best Picture nomination and is now considered one of the most important Westerns ever made. Clint Eastwood cited it as a major influence on Unforgiven, saying, "It showed the real brutal truth of frontier justice when nobody was ready to see it." Director William Wellman fought hard for realism, insisting on shooting the hanging scene without cuts or softening. The studio wanted a happy ending, where the men are saved at the last minute, but Wellman refused. When it premiered in southern states, theater owners received threatening calls. In 3 Alabama cities, local officials shut down screenings midway through. The New York Times praised its harsh, bitter lesson in democracy, while a Memphis newspaper called it dangerous propaganda. The film's stark realism and unflinching moral stance made it too uncomfortable for 1943 audiences, but perfectly positioned it to become recognized as a pioneering classic decades later. The Moon is Blue, 1953. Otto Preminger deliberately shattered the production code with this romantic comedy that dared to use words like virgin, pregnant, and mistress, commonplace today, but shocking then. The film became the first major Hollywood release to completely bypass the Hays Code. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it and organized boycotts nationwide. 3 states banned it outright. United Artists executives nearly had heart attacks when Preminger refused to make the demanded cuts, but stood by him when the film grossed over $6 million on a tiny budget. The controversy directly led to the collapse of the Hays Code. Preminger later said, "I made the film specifically to break the code. Someone had to shatter that ridiculous system, and I decided it might as well be me." It worked. The rigid censorship system never recovered its authority afterward. What's remarkable is that by today's standards, The Moon is Blue is completely innocent, a light comedy with no explicit scenes whatsoever. William Holden and David Niven play 2 men pursuing a young woman who speaks frankly about relationships. The Hays office demanded 12 dialogue changes, including removing the words virgin, seduce, and Pregnant. Preminger refused every single one. When the film was denied a code seal, United Artists released it anyway, challenging the code's authority. In Maryland, the state censor board confiscated prints and attempted to prosecute theater owners. The Supreme Court eventually overturned this decision, further weakening censorship powers. The film's massive success, despite the controversy, showed studios they could profit without code approval. Blood Feast, 1963. Herschel Gordon Lewis created the splatter film genre overnight with this micro-budget shocker about an Egyptian caterer who murders women to resurrect an ancient goddess. Made for just $24,500, it featured bright red paint like blood and gruesome practical effects never before seen in color. Censors lost it. The British Board of Film Classification straight up refused it a certificate in 1981, completely banning it. An uncut version briefly hit VHS shelves in 1982, but it got yanked immediately during Britain's big video nasties crackdown. Finally, it was banned permanently. Drive-in theaters reported record profits while playing it, with lines stretching for blocks. Lewis himself marketed it with the tagline, "Nothing so appalling in the annals of horror." Audiences vomited, fainted, and fled theaters. Lewis later admitted, "I knew it was terrible, but I also knew no one had ever seen anything like it." Lewis, a former English professor turned advertising executive, created Blood Feast purely as a business venture. He noticed horror films made money regardless of quality, but none showed explicit gore and color. Using bright red tempera paint for blood and animal organs from a local butcher shop for realistic effects, he shot the entire film in just 4 days. When Miami theater owners saw the rushes, they immediately booked it. One Florida drive-in reported selling more tickets in one night than they had in the previous month. The film was so profitable that Lewis quit advertising entirely to make exploitation films. Though banned in multiple countries, it has grossed over $7 million from a $24,500 investment. Film critic Roger Ebert wrote, "I am tempted to award it no stars, as a matter of principle, but it delivers what it promises." I Am Curious, Yellow, 1967. This Swedish film broke attendance records and the law simultaneously. Customs officials seized prints at the U.S. border, calling it obscene material. The ensuing legal battle reached the Supreme Court, splitting the justices 4-4, effectively making it legal by default. Theater owners who showed it faced arrest in 23 states. Religious groups formed 24-hour prayer chains outside cinemas. Despite minimal marketing due to newspaper ad restrictions, it became the highest-grossing foreign film in U.S. history at that point, earning over $20 million. The irony? Beneath the controversial scenes was a serious political documentary exploring classes' inequality, non-violence, and social justice. Critics later reassessed it, with Vincent Canby writing, "We were all so focused on a few minutes of footage that we missed the actual revolutionary content." The film became a test case for what constitutes art versus obscenity. Director Vilgot Sjöman crafted a politically charged film where actress Lena Nyman interviewed real Swedish citizens, including Martin Luther King Jr. during his Nobel Prize visit, about politics, nonviolence, and gender equality. But American distributors emphasized the few controversial scenes in marketing, creating a sensation. Lines around theaters became so commonplace that Johnny Carson joked about it on The Tonight Show. When a Massachusetts theater owner was arrested, the ACLU took the case. The Supreme Court ruling effectively ended film censorship for adult audiences. Years later, Sjöman expressed frustration that the political message was lost. Americans only saw the bedroom scenes, but missed the real radicalism, questioning authority and demanding institutional change. Titicut Follies, 1967. Directed by Frederick Wiseman, the film shows what life was like inside the Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane in Massachusetts. And it does not hold back. We're talking force-feeding, public humiliations, abuse, stuff no one had really seen on film before. After it was shot in 1966, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court banned the movie from being publicly shown, claiming it violated the privacy of the inmates. It was the first time in American history a documentary was suppressed by a court for privacy reasons. The state argued the film violated patient dignity, but the real motivation appeared to be covering up institutional abuses. When finally released 24 years later, it sparked massive reforms in mental health facilities nationwide. Stanley Kubrick reportedly studied it repeatedly while preparing for A Clockwork Orange. Wiseman spent 29 days filming inside Bridgewater, documenting horrific conditions. The title comes from an annual talent show where inmates performed for staff. The most disturbing scenes show a patient being force-fed through a nasal tube while guards mock him, naked patients paraded through hallways, and staff showing complete indifference to human suffering. Massachusetts Attorney General Elliot Richardson sued to stop the film's release after its premiere at the New York Film Festival. The court ruled that Wiseman could only show it to professionals in legal, medical, or social services fields. Even after Wiseman won a partial victory in 1969, the film remained effectively banned until 1991. When finally released, Washington Post critic Hal Hinson wrote, "What's most shocking is that this treatment was considered therapy." Ecstasy, 1933. Hedy Lamarr's Hollywood career was nearly destroyed before it began by this Czechoslovakian film, featuring the first non-pornographic depiction of a female climax in cinematic history. It also contained a scene where Lamarr swims completely unclothed, shocking for mainstream cinema of the era. Pope Pius XI personally condemned it. U.S. Customs seized and burned prints. When Lamarr's husband at the time, Austrian ammunition manufacturer Fritz Mandl, couldn't buy up all existing copies, he reportedly tried bribing theater owners across Europe to stop screenings. Despite being banned in Germany, the United States, and numerous other countries, underground screenings made it legendary. Film historian Kevin Brownlow noted, "It's fascinating that a film famous for a taboo scene actually contained one of cinema's most important acting breakthroughs, the first truly naturalistic performance in European film." Lamarr was just 18 when she made the film with Czech director Gustav Machady. The controversy made her famous, but almost ended her career before it began. After marrying Mandl, he became obsessed with suppressing the film, even attempting to buy every copy in existence. She eventually fled her controlling marriage, escaping to London, where she met MGM head Louis B. Mayer. He initially refused to sign her because of Ecstasy, but she followed him onto the same transatlantic ship to America and negotiated a contract before they reached New York. MGM rebranded her as the most beautiful woman in the world, but the Ecstasy controversy followed her throughout her career. The film itself used innovative techniques like close-ups of her face and symbolic imagery of a pearl necklace breaking during emotional scenes, techniques later adopted by mainstream cinema. Paths of glory followed, including Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, The Birth of a Nation, 1915. D.W. Griffith's Civil War epic follows two families, one Union, one Confederate. But that's not what people remember. The movie glorified the Ku Klux Klan, showed brutal racist stereotypes, and basically acted like Reconstruction was a mistake. It was made for about $100,000, an insane budget back then, and it turned into Hollywood's first blockbuster, making over $10 million at the time, which would be hundreds of millions today. American civil rights organizations protested the hell out of it. Riots broke out in Boston and Philadelphia. Tons of cities banned it. Chicago, Pittsburgh, Denver, Las Vegas. Even whole states like Ohio and Kansas tried to block it. The NAACP launched its first major national campaign against the film. Thomas Dixon, author of the source novel, reportedly said, "The real purpose of my film was to revolutionize Northern audiences and transform every man into a Southern partisan." The film's technical innovations revolutionized cinema. Close-ups, fade-outs, night photography, color tinting for dramatic effect. All techniques Griffith either invented or perfected. But its content was so inflammatory that even in 1915, mayors and governors took action. The NAACP picketed theaters and distributed pamphlets documenting the film's historical distortions. When it premiered at the White House, President Woodrow Wilson allegedly remarked, "It's like writing history with lightning," though he later distanced himself as protests mounted. For decades after, black filmmakers created response films challenging its narrative. Oscar Michaud's Within Our Gates, 1920, directly countered Griffith's distortions. In 1992, the Library of Congress added it to the National Film Registry while acknowledging its racist overtones and blatant historical revisionism. The Pawnbroker, 1964. Sidney Lumet shattered Hollywood taboos with this Holocaust survivor tale starring Rod Steiger. It became the first mainstream American film to show a woman's chest without romantic context, a scene integral to the protagonist's trauma. The Production Code Administration initially refused certification. Allied artists threatened to release it without code approval, which would have been unprecedented for a major studio. The standoff forced the Hays office to revise the code rather than face complete industry abandonment. Martin Scorsese called this the moment when the code finally admitted defeat. Despite critical acclaim and Steiger's Oscar nomination, many theaters refused to book it. The Catholic Legion of Decency gave it a separate classification rather than condemn it, acknowledging its artistic merit while warning parishioners. It barely recouped its $1 million budget, but fundamentally changed what could be shown in American cinema. Steiger's portrayal of Sol Nazerman, a concentration camp survivor who lost his family and now runs a Harlem pawn shop, was revolutionary in its depiction of trauma. Director Sidney Lumet fought for the controversial flashback scenes showing camp prisoners, arguing they were essential to understanding Sol's emotional numbness. When the production code refused approval, Lumet and producer Ely Landau announced they would release it without the seal, a potentially industry-changing move. Facing this challenge, the code administrators met in emergency session and created a new special exception category for artistically necessary scenes that would normally violate standards. This exception became the crack that eventually shattered the entire censorship system. The American Legion called for boycotts, but critics recognized its importance. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times wrote, "This is more than a movie. It's a landmark in American cultural maturity. Häxan 1922. This Swedish-Danish silent film about witchcraft and hysteria was so graphic it was banned across most of Europe and heavily censored in America. Director Benjamin Christensen spent years researching medieval witchcraft, creating disturbingly realistic recreations of torture, devil worship, and mass hysteria. The film intercuts scholarly lecture segments with dramatic recreations of witches flying on broomsticks, kissing the devil's posterior, and giving birth to demons. Religious authorities called it a dangerous glorification of Satanism, despite its scholarly approach debunking witch hunts. U.S. censors cut nearly 25 minutes, removing all scenes showing torture and removing dialogue screens mentioning hysteria as a medical condition. Christensen went bankrupt after its commercial failure, but lived long enough to see it recognized as a masterpiece. The Criterion Collection calls it the most impressive visualizations of the Dark Ages ever committed to film. What makes Häxan extraordinary is its hybrid format, part documentary, part horror film, which was completely unprecedented in 1922. Christensen used actual historical documents, including the 15th century witch hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum, to create authentic recreations. The film's thesis was revolutionary, that medieval witch trials were actually persecutions of the mentally ill, elderly, and socially marginalized. This feminist and psychological interpretation was decades ahead of academic consensus. Christensen himself played the devil in the film's most notorious scenes, which used innovative special effects, including superimpositions and stop-motion animation. When shown in the U.S. in 1929, it was retitled Witchcraft Through the Ages, with narration by William S. Burroughs and a jazz score. Contemporary critics now recognize it as a milestone in both documentary and horror filmmaking that influenced everything from Carl Dreyer to the Blair Witch Project. The Well of Loneliness, 1951. The first serious attempt to portray a lesbian relationship in American cinema was shut down 3 weeks into filming. Based on Radcliffe Hall's controversial 1928 novel, the production faced unprecedented interference from the Production Code Administration before shooting even began. Studio head Howard Hughes, known for fighting censors, abandoned the project after pressure from stockholders and distributor threats. All footage was reportedly destroyed. Star Katharine Hepburn, who had fought for the project, later said, "They weren't ready for it. We were 20 years too early." The film's shutdown had a chilling effect that kept realistic LGBTQ characters off American screens for decades. Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet called it the most important film never completed. Props and costume pieces reportedly appeared in other RKO productions throughout the 1950s. The original novel had been banned in England after a highly publicized obscenity trial, despite containing no explicit content. Its crime was portraying same-gender love as natural and worthy of respect. When independent producer Samuel Goldwyn secretly purchased the rights, several stars, including Hepburn and Ingrid Bergman, expressed interest. Director George Cukor, who had previously worked with Hepburn on several films, agreed to direct if strict secrecy was maintained during pre-production. Sets were built under false production names, but word leaked to gossip columnist Hedda Hopper, who launched a public campaign against it. The Catholic Legion of Decency threatened to condemn every RKO release for 5 years if production continued. Hughes initially stood firm, but capitulated when theater chains threatened boycotts. The Production Code Administration used the incident to add explicit prohibitions against sex perversion that remained until 1961. The Connection, 1961. Shirley Clarke's raw portrayal of heroin addicts waiting for their dealer revolutionized independent cinema and promptly got banned. Shot in a documentary style, it was the first American film to use certain taboo words and show the process of preparation and injection. New York State's Film Licensing Board declared it obscene and refused classification. After winning in court, the film opened in New York only to have police raid the theater and arrest the projectionist during its second showing. The case went through multiple appeals before finally being declared protected speech. Despite winning the Critics' Prize at Cannes Film Festival, it could only be screened in a handful of U.S. cities. Clarke later revealed that none of the actors were actual users. Their performances were so realistic that rumors persisted for years that she had filmed real addicts. The Connection began as an off-Broadway play by Jack Gelber, performed by the groundbreaking Living Theater Company. Its cinema verite style was revolutionary, a fake documentary where the filmmaker appears on screen interviewing the addicts. When Clarke adapted it, she maintained this structure but pushed further with unbroken takes lasting up to 10 minutes. The film unfolds in real time as jazz musicians and other addicts wait in a grungy apartment for their dealer. Clarke's documentary approach was so convincing that when the New York censors banned it for showing drug use, her legal defense argued it was a documentary recording real events. The case established that film licensing boards couldn't ban a movie solely for immorality without proving it was obscene under legal standards. The landmark ruling opened doors for independent filmmakers dealing with adult themes. Musician Freddie Red's jazz score, performed on screen by the actors, later became a classic album, Viridiana, 1961. Luis Buñuel's masterpiece won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, was immediately declared blasphemous by the Vatican newspaper, and got banned in Spain for 16 years. The film's parody of Da Vinci's Last Supper with beggars, followed by an implied assault attempt on a novice nun, caused international outrage. Spanish dictator Franco had personally approved the script, but hadn't seen the final film before it went to Cannes. When the Vatican condemned it, Franco ordered all copies destroyed and removed the officials who had approved it. The negative was smuggled to France, saving it from destruction. Despite being officially non-existent in Spain, underground screenings made it legendary among film students. When finally shown legally in 1977, after Franco's death, it broke box office records. Buñuel later said, "I didn't expect the film to be shown in Spain until after Franco's death. I just didn't expect to still be alive when it happened." Buñuel had been living in exile from Spain since the Civil War. Franco's government, eager for international cultural recognition, invited him back to make a film in Spain, believing the aging director had abandoned his radical youth. Buñuel submitted a sanitized script, but filmed a subversive masterpiece. The Last Supper scene, where beggars freeze in the exact positions of Christ and the apostles, while Handel's Messiah plays, was not in the approved screenplay. Neither was the scene where the novice burns her crown of thorns, or the ending suggesting a ménage à trois. The film was shot in just 30 days to avoid government oversight. When the scandal erupted, Buñuel fled Spain immediately. The film's producer was imprisoned briefly, and the censor who approved the script was fired. Despite the ban, Viridiana became Buñuel's international breakthrough. Film historian Raymond Durgnat called it the most perfectly realized of all Buñuel's films, and the most devastating critique of religion ever put on film. The Last Temptation of Christ, 1988. You've got Martin Scorsese, one of Hollywood's greatest directors, adapting a famous book about Jesus Christ. Except in this version, Jesus imagines living a regular life. He marries Mary Magdalene, has kids, and lives as a normal guy. And for religious groups, that meant Scorsese was literally messing with the foundation of Christianity. Paramount originally agreed to make it, but bailed after the backlash started. Universal finally picked it up, but only gave Scorsese a $7 million budget, peanuts for a studio movie even back then. Even before the movie was released, protesters lined up outside theaters. In France, things got really violent. A theater was literally firebombed during a screening, injuring 13 people. Multiple countries straight up banned the film, just completely refused to show it. The film's controversial dream sequence occupies just 20 minutes of the 164-minute running time, but generated unprecedented outrage. Fundamentalist groups organized massive boycotts without having seen the film. In Raleigh, North Carolina, a theater owner received death threats. Several theater chains refused to book it. Blockbuster Video wouldn't stock it. The film was banned in Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Philippines, Singapore, and parts of the Middle East. Scorsese required police protection for months. Willem Dafoe, who played Jesus, later said, "The irony is that the film is deeply reverent. The protests were organized by people determined to be offended without understanding the material." Despite the controversy, the film received an Oscar nomination for Scorsese's direction. Author Nikos Kazantzakis, whose novel was the basis for the film, had been excommunicated by the Greek Orthodox Church when the book was published in 1955. Angel Face, 1953. Otto Preminger's film noir was condemned by women's groups for a scene where Robert Mitchum slaps Gene Simmons, then she slaps him, and he slaps her again, harder. RKO Studio head Howard Hughes reportedly ordered the scene added over Preminger's objections, then used it in marketing materials. The National Legion of Women Voters organized boycotts. 3 major theater chains refused to book it. Critics called it dangerous and irresponsible. Mitchum later claimed he had objected to the scene, but Hughes threatened to suspend him without pay if he didn't comply. Despite the controversy, or because of it, the film performed well enough at the box office to rescue RKO from bankruptcy. Film historian Eddie Mueller called it the film that pushed the boundaries of what could be shown in terms of toxic relationships, a direct predecessor to films like Basic Instinct. What made Angel Face particularly controversial was its portrayal of an unrepentant femme fatale who faces no moral judgment within the film itself. Gene Simmons plays Diane Tremaine, who murders her stepmother and father for inheritance money and tries to frame her lover. The production code demanded criminals be punished, but Preminger subverted this by having her commit suicide rather than face justice. Women's groups were especially outraged by promotional materials that featured the slapping scene with taglines like, "She loved one man enough to kill 2 others." The American Psychiatric Association condemned the film for its dangerous portrayal of sociopathic behavior as seductive. Hughes, always eager for controversy, arranged anonymous calls to women's organizations, alerting them to the shocking content. Mitchum later admitted to deliberately adding a second, harder slap, not in the script, to protest being forced to do the scene at all. The Wages of Fear, 1953. Henri-Georges Clouzot's white-knuckle thriller about desperate men driving trucks of nitroglycerin through treacherous mountain roads was heavily censored in America, cutting nearly 50 minutes from its original French version. The removed scenes contained anti-American sentiments and criticism of the oil industry. The U.S. State Department pressured distributors to make the cuts, concerned about its portrayal of an American oil company exploiting South American workers. The French government was equally unhappy with how it portrayed French colonialism. Several South American countries banned it outright. When finally restored to its original length in the 1990s, critics declared it one of the greatest thrillers ever made. Alfred Hitchcock reportedly studied it repeatedly, saying, This is how you create suspense without resorting to cheap tricks. William Friedkin's The Sorcerer was a direct remake. The film's political content was actually more radical than its suspense sequences. Clouseau's uncut version portrayed the American oil company deliberately underpaying local workers and maintaining dangerous conditions that killed employees. He also included scenes showing French expatriates exploiting indigenous women and acting as colonial overlords. The American cut removed an entire 30-minute sequence showing the poverty of the town and the workers' desperate living conditions. With this context missing, American viewers saw only the suspense narrative. The film won both the Golden Bear at Berlin and the Grand Prix at Cannes, but American distributor DCA refused to release it until extensive cuts were made. Despite these cuts, it became an art house hit in America. The New York Times called it the most suspenseful film ever made, even in its truncated form. When the Criterion Collection restored the complete version in 1999, many critics reassessed it as not just a thriller, but a powerful political statement about capitalism and colonialism. Un Chien Andalou, 1929. Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dalí created this surrealist short film specifically to shock and outrage. The infamous eye-slitting scene caused audience members to faint during its premiere. Buñuel reportedly stood behind the screen with his pockets full of rocks, expecting a riot and planning to throw them at the audience in self-defense. Religious authorities across Europe condemned it as degenerate art. Spain banned it during Franco's entire 36-year regime. The film contains no conventional narrative, featuring disjointed scenes including ants crawling from a hole in a man's hand and rotting donkey carcasses on pianos. Despite being one of the most analyzed films in academic history, Buñuel insisted there was no symbolic meaning, no idea or image that might lend itself to a rational explanation of any kind would be accepted. When asked what the film meant, Dalí reportedly answered, "It means nothing. That's the point." Buñuel and Dalí wrote the screenplay in 6 days, following one rule. No idea or image that might lend itself to a rational explanation would be accepted. They took turns suggesting images, and if either one could explain why an image should be included, it was immediately rejected. The infamous eye-slitting scene was inspired by a dream Buñuel had. The film's title has no connection to its content. It was chosen specifically to mislead viewers into expecting an educational film about Andalusia. The premiere at Studio d'Ursuline in Paris was attended by the elite of Parisian society, including Pablo Picasso, Le Corbusier, and Jean Cocteau. Buñuel said later, "I expected a riot and a disaster, and instead I got a triumph." The Vatican formally condemned it as blasphemous. The film ran for 8 months in Paris, making it one of the first avant-garde films to achieve commercial success. Hitler's Ministry of Propaganda later included it in their infamous Degenerate Art exhibition as an example of cultural degeneracy. The Man with the Golden Arm, 1955. Otto Preminger deliberately released this film about heroin addiction without production code approval, creating an industry crisis. Frank Sinatra's portrayal of withdrawal was so graphic that theaters received complaints of audience members becoming physically ill during screenings. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it. Major theater chains initially refused to show it. The Production Code Administration threatened to revoke certification for any studio that distributed future Preminger films. Nevertheless, it was commercially successful, earning over $4 million on a $1 million budget. The controversy forced the production code to create a new category, allowing previously forbidden topics, if handled tastefully. Sinatra later revealed he spent time in actual rehabilitation facilities researching the role. "I wanted to show the truth of addiction, when everyone else just wanted to pretend it didn't exist in nice neighborhoods." Preminger had purchased the rights to Nelson Algren's novel, knowing the production code explicitly prohibited depictions of drug addiction. When he announced the project, the Hayes office warned United Artists they would lose their ability to release any films with code approval if they distributed it. Preminger responded by hiring Saul Bass to create a groundbreaking title sequence featuring an abstract arm, which became iconic in marketing materials where the word heroin couldn't be mentioned. The withdrawal scene, showing Sinatra sweating and hallucinating while locked in a room, was filmed in a single take after Sinatra spent time observing actual addicts. When the film premiered without code approval, the United Artists Theater in Chicago defied the exhibition chains by showing it. Lines stretched for blocks. Within weeks, other theaters followed suit, effectively ending the production code's power over distribution. In 1956, the code was revised to allow previously forbidden subjects, including drug addiction when presented with moral caution. The film received 3 Oscar nominations, and Elmer Bernstein's jazz score became a best-selling album. These films didn't just push boundaries, they obliterated them, often at devastating personal and professional cost to their creators. Each one cracked the foundation of censorship a little more, making today's creative freedom possible. Which of these shocked you the most? Have you managed to track down any of these controversial classics? Hit like and subscribe for more cinematic stories Hollywood tried burying.